Masechet Baba Batra, Daf Kof Nun 150. We're talking about the categories of land versus movable items and how to define those categories and some things that seem to slip between the cracks. Pishita Amar Metaltelai Leplanya, Kol Mane de Tashmishte Kane, Lebar Mechite Usare. Someone says, I am going to give all of my movable property to this person. So then all movable property, meaning all utensils, go and are acquired by that person. However, that does not include wheat and barley. Even though wheat and barley, they're not connected to the ground. So they're not land, but generally you'd call that produce, and most people don't mean when they say movable items, they mean like furniture and utensils and things. They're not talking about the produce that's stored up in their storehouse. However, if he says kol metaltele leplanya, he adds the word kol, afilu chite usare, then he must be including something else, because otherwise why would you need to say kol? And therefore we say, well, what else does he want to include besides the regular utensils? In that case, we do include the wheat and the barley in that gift. And in that case, even the upper millstone, because that's often removed from its spot. You take it off to clean it out, whatever, and you put it back. So that's called a movable item. It's not included in the first thing because it's not generally moved, but once in a while it's moved. So then that if you add the word kol, then he gets the upper millstone. However, not the lower millstone. That's a much heavier item that's on the floor that generally you leave there for a long time. However, if he says kol de mitaltel afilu rechaim tachtona kaneh, if the guy says I'm going to give anything that can be moved, that's even more general category, and the lower millstone, technically it can be moved. You might need a couple of people to lift it up, and generally you don't, but since it's not actually bolted to the ground, it can be moved. Therefore, that also would be given as a gift. So all that is simple. Now we have a more difficult question. Abda kimekarka'a or kimetaltela dameh? A question that comes up several times. Are slaves, we're talking about Canaanite slaves, are they considered like land or like property? For some laws, they're like land. For some, they're like movable property. So if you're giving something away, and you say, I'm giving the land or I'm giving them the property, does that include the slaves or not? So we're going to offer a couple of proofs. The first one is from a Mishnah earlier in the Masechet on 68a that says, "Hamocher et ha'ir machar batim shichin u'marot u'mer hasaot u'bet habadin u'bet hashlachin aval lo et ha'metaltelin." If someone sells a city, then he's selling all of the land and everything that's attached to the land, and that will include houses and ditches and caves, bathhouse, olive press, and irrigated fields. But it does not include movable items. That's not part of the sale if you're selling a city. However, if in the deed of the sale of the city you say, I'm selling the city and everything that's in it, well, in that case, that does include the movable items, even the animals and the slaves. So we're going to discuss in a second. What do you mean, even the animals and the slaves? Okay, so we'll come back to that. But right now the proof is from the beginning of it. So if you say that slaves are like movable items, then that explains why they are not sold in the first case. If they say, I'm selling you the city, then you do not get the slaves because you do not get any movable items, and slaves are included in movable items. Then the Resha makes sense. But if you think that slaves is included in land, then why should the slaves not go along with the city? All things that are called land go along with the sale, and so slaves also should do it. So therefore, this is a proof that Rav Acha tells Rav Asher that slaves are considered movable items. So Rav Asher replies, that's not a good proof. Elamai, mai afilu. So what are you saying? That's movable items? Then how can you explain the word afilu? It says, if you say, I'm selling the city and everything in it, then all the movable items go, even the animals and the slaves. What do you mean, even the animals and the slaves? They're movable items. So why do you have to say even? I know. So what are you going to explain? I know how you can explain this. You're going to make a distinction between movable items that move on their own and movable items that don't move on their own. A couch, a table, those a spoon, those are regular movable items that don't move by themselves. You have to move it. And so those are things that's typical metalteleh, and that will go along with the city if you say it and everything in it. Things that move on their own is a different category, because it's not quite things. It's not quite like furniture. The animals and slaves, they move on their own. So we have to say even those. You might think that these are even past like a separate category. There's land, which doesn't move at all. There's movable items that, like furniture, that don't move, and so those go. Maybe movable items that move on their own, like animals and slaves, maybe they're not included in the sale, because you can't call it the city and what's in it if these are things that can decide they're going to leave, they're going to come back, and they move on their own. So that's why it says afilu, even things that might leave the city on their own, nevertheless they're considered part of the city. So that's how you're going to answer the question. Once you have that distinction, Rav Ashi says, I can use that for the opposite proof and actually show that we can reconcile even the Resha, even with saying that slaves are like land. Afilu tema kemekarka'ed dameh. Shane mekarka'ed denayid mekarka'a de la nayid. I can even tell you that slaves are considered land. However, there's a distinction between land that moves and land that doesn't move. Really, slaves are like land in general. However, when you're coming to sell the city, so then what's sold if you say I'm selling you the city? Only land that doesn't move. That's all the things on this list. But land that does move, that's meaning a slave is like land, but it moves, so it's not going to be sold, not because it's a movable item, not because it's like metalteleh. It is in fact like land. But within land, there's two types of land. So therefore, once you make this distinction, which you have to make anyway, in order to explain the word afilu, between movable items that stay put and movable items that move on their own. So once you agree with that distinction, I'll just use the same distinction within two types of land, and thereby I can explain that really slaves are land according to this Mishnah, and therefore there's no proof from here. Amar leRavina leRav Ashi. And so now a second try from a Mishnah in Masechet Pe'ah that we saw yesterday. Tashema. Hakoteb la'abdo kol nechasav. Yasa ben chorin. Shier karka kol shehu. Lo yasa ben chorin. Rabbi Shimon omer le'olam hu ben chorin. Ad shiomar kol nechasai netunin leploni abdi. Chutz me'achad meribo shebahen. The Mishnah teaches, if someone owns a whole bunch of things, he owns some land, he owns movable items, and he owns a Canaanite slave. And he writes down in a document, I'm going to give all of my property to this slave. Well, in that case, it includes the slave himself. So paradoxically, by giving this slave everything, the slave acquires his own freedom. Good. That's if he gives everything to the slave. However, according to Tanakama, if the master says, I'm giving you, my slave, everything except for some little piece of land, then the slave does not go free, because we are considering that maybe when he said, I'm keeping for myself a little piece of land, maybe within that land, what he's referring to is the slave himself. Okay, according to this, if you just stop here, this would be a proof that a slave is in fact like land, because only when he keeps for himself land, then he's keeping the slave for himself, and so land is equal to a slave. But this is not actually the main part of Ravina's proof to Rav Ashi. It's going to come from the discussion afterwards, which is actually going to prove the opposite. So actually this Mishnah we're going to use in two different ways at the same time. Rabbi Shimon omer, le'olam hu ben chorin, ad shiomar kol nechasei netunin leploni abdi, chutz me'achad miribo shebahen. Rabbi Shimon disagrees with Tanakama and says that the slave would go free even if he keeps some part of land. Sounds like according to him, a slave is not called land. And the only time that the slave would not go free is if he says, I'm giving you, my slave, everything except for 1/10,000th of what I own. And so that's a more general category. I'm just keeping something that I own 1/10,000th, and so the slave might be included in that 1/10,000th. And again, here, it doesn't mean he's so rich that he has 10,000 times more than the worth of a slave. It could be a way of like belittling the slave, like, I'm keeping 1/10,000, meaning I'm keeping you, almost worthless slave or something like that. So that's Rabbi Shimon. Now, about that Mishnah, Avamar Rav Dimi bar Yosef b'amar Rabbi Elazar, asu metaltelin shiur esel ibed, velo asu metaltelin shiur esel ketubah. Rav Dimi bar Yosef said the name of Rabbi Elazar, that the Mishnah considers movable items to be a withholding regarding an Eved. In other words, if the master says, you, my slave, I'm giving you everything except for some movable items, except for this couch, except for the furniture, except for some movable items, then that is considered a withholding, and maybe he's withholding the slave also, and therefore the slave does not go free. So this is actually going to be a proof that the slave is considered a metaltelin. Let's see the proof first, and then we'll go back to this line about ketuvah. What's the reason for this line that withholding movable items is considered withholding the freedom of the slave himself? So he explains the reason is that a slave is a movable item, and therefore a movable item within a movable item, that's considered withholding something. I'm trying to give my slave some things, but I say I'm withholding movable item. A slave is within the category of movable items, and that's why this withholding is significant, and the master keeps ownership of the slave. That explains the regarding slaves. So it doesn't matter whether he says land or movable items. Land has just happened to bring that example, maybe because of what came before that, just contextually, but really it applies both to land and movable items. If he withholds anything for himself, the master, then the slave does not go free. However, there's a contrast between a slave and the ketubah. The case of a ketubah is someone on his deathbed says, I'm giving all of my property to my sons, except for some small piece of land that he gives to his wife. And his wife is quiet, is there, and doesn't say anything. In that case, the wife loses her ketubah. You see, if he gives all of his everything to his sons and leaves nothing at all, nothing for himself and nothing for his wife, then, and the wife doesn't say anything, she doesn't lose her ketubah because she has a lien on everything. She has a lien on all the property, and therefore she's not saying anything because, the sons will inherit, and then she will collect from the sons, from the heirs. Whoever has the estate, she'll collect from there. However, by taking a small piece of land and accepting it, so then we have to assume that this small piece of land she accepted in lieu of payment of her ketubah. And so that's if it's land. So Rav Dimi says that metaltelin. What if the husband says, listen, I'm giving you a couch, and everything goes to my sons except this couch, that this goes to my wife. In that case, is that considered withholding such that she would lose her ketubah? No, it's not. Even if she gets a couch and the furniture and everything and lots of movable items, that is not considered withholding that would prevent her from collecting the ketubah. And so what's the reason for that? Why this distinction? Here it is, because a ketubah is collected from land. When the woman has a ketubah, she has a lien on the husband's land, and therefore only if she receives land, that land that she's receiving means I'll take this land and I give up on my lien of all the rest of the land. I give up on my right to collect the ketubah. Because she has a lien on land, so only if she gets land do we assume that she's taking that instead. However, the movable items are not so. She cannot collect just from movable items. She has a lien on land. There's no lien on movable items. And therefore, just because she got this couch and this bed doesn't mean that she is giving up her right on the lien to the land. And that's why You can't compare the two categories. Something that is withheld from movable items is not going to be called withholding with regard to what she's owed from land. That explains the distinction. Okay. In some, with the question back, the original question was: are slaves considered land or movable items? Although from Tanakama here, actually it looks like they're land. But the main point of Ravina's challenge to Rav Asher, or attempted proof to Rav Asher, is from here that if you withhold movable items, as the master withholds movable items, then he does not go free because, and Rava explains to Rav Nachman this point, the slaves are considered movable items themselves. So that's a proof that they are movable items, right? Amale anan mishum delav kerut gita matninan la. Rav Asher says, no, that's not how we explain that Mishnah. The reason for that Mishnah is completely different. It's because this is not a complete severance. It's not a document of complete severance. When someone is divorcing his wife, and we compare the two, divorcing a wife and freeing a slave, when you divorce a wife, has to be no strings attached. You can't say, I divorced my wife except for she can't marry anybody else. That's not called a divorce, because you're not letting her go free completely. You can't have any strings attached. It has to be a complete severance. So too with freeing a slave. If you say, I'm freeing the slave, I'm giving him everything, it has to be everything, then it's a complete divorce, a complete freeing of the slave. But if you're saying, I'm freeing the slave except for anything, the freedom does not apply. And so therefore, it actually doesn't matter whether he says land, I'm keeping for myself some land, or I'm keeping for myself some movable items. It doesn't matter. Either way, the slave does not go free. And it doesn't matter whether you consider the slave land or a movable item. The point is, he's not making a complete severance. That's the reason. And therefore, this actually is not a proof, not from the beginning, the Tanakama that says like karka, and not from the statement of Rav Dimi, who says that it's not just karka, even metaltalin. Either way, the reason is completely different because it has to be a complete severance. Amar Rav Nachman, Chamisha ad shichtabu kol nichsehem. Okay, now that we've discussed several, I think 3 different categories of laws where you have to give everything away in order for that to take effect, and if you keep part of it, then it does not take effect. Now, Rava says in the name of Rav Nachman, actually there's 5 laws for which this applies, that you have to write everything. Ve'eluhen, shechimera, abdo, ishto, ubanav, mavrachat. We'll go through each of these 5 and explain them. Shechimera, ditnan. Shechimera shekatav kol nechasav lacherim. Ve'shier karka kol shehu, matinato kayemet. Lo shier karka kol shehu, en matinato kayemet. Someone is on his deathbed. That's the case that we learned in the Mishnah just a few dapim ago. That if someone's on his deathbed and he says, write a will. And he gives all of his property away to other people, to his son, to his daughter, to whoever. And he left for himself even a little bit of land, and then he got better. Then his gift is a final gift, because why did he keep some for himself? And we saw before, he keeps for himself an amount that he can use for his livelihood. So why did he keep that for himself? Because he was thinking, even if I get better, I have sufficient to last. And that's why he's giving a gift, and that's a final sale. However, if he did not leave for himself anything at all, then it's clear he only wanted to give all those things away because he thought he was dying. So what is he going to need anything in the grave? But if he gets better, then he never meant to give everything away as a gift. Nobody would give everything away and be completely homeless. So this law that the Shri Meraz giving away of things does not count, and he can get it back if he gets better, is only true if he gives everything away. That's number 1. Abdo. Ditnan. Hakotev kol nechasav la'abdo yasa ben chorin shi'ed karka kolshu lo yasa ben chorin. That's the case that we just talked about, Mishnah Pe'ah. If someone, a master, gives everything to his slave, then the slave goes free, as long as he gives everything away to the slave. But if he holds something back for himself, like a piece of land, even a small piece of land, then he does not go free, because that's not a complete severance. Ishto, damar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, hakotev kol nechasav lishto lo asa'a ela apotropa. Regarding the law of a wife is also one we saw already. Rav Yudah says, name of Shemuel. If someone writes in his will, I'm giving everything to my wife, then ironically, we don't give anything to the wife, but rather she is only a steward, an administrator of the property. Why did he do that? We assume that the husband wants the sons, his heirs, to give respect to his wife after he dies, and therefore he makes her the administrator, and that way they will be sure to give her respect. So interestingly, if he gives his wife half the things, even 90% of his property, then she gets it permanently as a gift, because he gave her only some things, and the other 10%, whatever he gave to his sons, he gave to whoever he wanted to give it to. Then it's a final gift. But if he gives everything to his wife, then she's only an administrator. The case of sons is also one that we saw in the Mishnah in Pe'ah earlier. Ditnan, hakotev kol nechasav lebana v'chatab lishto karka kol shehu ibeda ketubata. If someone writes or in a will that he's giving all of his property to his sons, except for a small piece of land that he's giving to his wife, then we assume she's accepting that piece of land in lieu of her ketubah payment, and she loses her ketubah. However, if he gives everything to the sons, then she can't collect her ketubah. So this is yet another law that depends on the husband giving everything away, then she does get her ketubah. Mavrachat amar mor, mavrachat tzericha shetichtob kol nechaseha. Mavrachat is a woman who wants to shelter property. Let's say she has property from a previous marriage or from whatever, and now she's getting married. She doesn't want her husband that she's about to marry to take her property, and then if she dies, then he's going to inherit it and all that. She wants to keep hold of it. So what does she do? She gives it to a third party, and she could say an explicit condition. Listen, I'm giving it to you, my friend, Mrs. Friedman, on condition that when I get divorced or my husband dies, I want it all back. So she could say that. But even if she doesn't make an explicit condition, if she writes that this friend will get everything, then it's clear. Why would she give her friend everything? It's clear she's doing it only to shelter her property, and therefore it works. And when she gets divorced, she can go to her friend and says, I only gave this to you so that I can get it back, and then she can get it back. However, if she gives her friend only half of the stuff, then we say, well, maybe that's just a gift. It's not clear if you give her half that she meant to shelter the property, and therefore she cannot get it back. In all of these cases, that includes, it doesn't matter whether it's a land or even a movable item that the person is holding back, that's considered holding back. It's not considered that you're giving everything away. Except for the case of ketubah. The rabbis only made this takana regarding land. Only for land, they said, if a husband gives everything to his sons except for a piece of land that he gives to his wife, then she loses her ketubah. However, if he gives everything to his sons except for a couch, and the couch is, listen, I'm giving this couch to my wife, she can still collect the ketubah, because the couch has nothing to do with the collection of the ketubah. The collection of the ketubah is a lien on the land, and just because she accepted a couch and didn't say anything doesn't mean she's giving up a lien on the land, and so therefore that's not considered withholding just because you withheld some movable item. Amemad amad metaltele dichtibi beketubah v'itnehu be'aynayhu haveh shiur. Amemad says an exception to this last rule. If it's a movable item that is explicitly written in the ketubah and is still extant, you still have it. Let's say it's a certain couch that she really likes, and in the ketubah it says, upon the end of this marriage, you get this yellow couch that's in the living room. In that case, this is designated as payment of her ketubah. So if, when he's dying, he says, I'm giving everything away to my sons except for that yellow couch, and she accepts it, then that is considered a withholding. We assume that she accepted the yellow couch in lieu of her ketubah payment, and she cannot collect her ketubah payment. Why? Because that's something that's explicitly written in the ketubah. So why would she say, okay, yes, I'm accepting that? She should say, no, of course I'm getting that because I want my ketubah payment. If she didn't object, just like if she didn't object when she gets a little piece of land, if she didn't object, then we assume that she's accepting that in lieu of the rest of her ketubah payment, and she loses any lien that she has on any property of the estate. While we're making lists, we now quote another list of items that are called nechasim. Nechasim is a general word that means property, and so now we want to know what exactly is included. Turns out pretty much everything. Amar nechasai leplanya, avda ikre nichseh, ditnan, hakoteb kol nechasav leavdo, yasa ben horin. If someone says, my property, using the word nechasim, I want to give to this person, well, that will include an eved, because Canaanite slaves are called nechasim. We see this in the Mishnah that says, if someone writes to his slave, I'm giving you all of my nechasim, then the slave goes free, because the slave himself is included in the word nechasim. Ar'a ikre nichse. Land is called nechasim. Ditnan. Nechasim sheyesh lahem achrayut niknin bechesef, bishtar, ubehazaka. The Mishnah teaches that nechasim, property, that can be used as a guarantee, that means land, can be acquired in three ways: by giving money, or by giving over a deed, or in taking physical possession by like locking the gate of it. And so this is called nechasim. It's a category of nechasim that happens to be that you can use it for a guarantee. So land is included. Gilima ikre nichse. Clothing is called nechasim, ditnan, v'she'en lahem achrayut en niknin ela b'meshicha. Whereas items that cannot be used as a guarantee can be acquired by pulling. So that would mean like a cloak, garments, all kinds of things like that, that you would pick up and take with you are called nechasim. So that is referring to clothing and movable items. Zuzeh ikre nichse ditnan, v'she'en lahem achrayut niknin im nechasim. שיש להם אחריות בכסף ובשטר ובחזקה. Money is also, cash is also called nechasim, as we see in the Mishnah that says that you can acquire things that you cannot use as a guarantee together with things that you can use as a guarantee in these three ways. In other words, if I am giving you land, then I can add on, while you're taking the land, you also have a kinyan agav, and I can send also other items, movable items. So far, we don't know for sure that this refers to money, but we're going to prove that from the following story. So anyway, the point is here is that if you acquire land through one of the three ways that you acquire land, with money, with a deed, or by taking possession of it. So I give you land. If you give me money, then you acquire the land. And as I'm giving you the land, I can say, so agav, the furniture you also get, the car you also get. Now, how do you know that cash is actually something I'm giving you with the land? Now, we're not talking about the money that you're paying me for the land. And that is transferred by just giving me the money. But it's let's say there's other coins and things that I want to transfer to you with the land. Does that work? Is that included in nechasim she'en lahem acharayut? The answer is yes. In the following story, ki hadra papa havu le'teresada fezuzeh bechozai. Akninu ni haled l'Rav Shmuel bar Acha agav asipa debete ki ata nefak le'apeh ad tavach. Here's a story we saw. We've learned once or twice before. Regarding Rav Papa, he had deposited some money, 12,000 dinar, with the people that lived in Bechozai. He said, hold on to this for me. He loaned it to them, and now he wants to get it back, but it's far away. And Rav Papa, he didn't want to go and travel there himself. But it turns out that Rav Shmuel bar Acha was going there anyway, and so he wanted to transfer the ownership of the coins to Rav Shmuel, so that Rav Shmuel would have standing in court. See, if he's just a third party, he comes and says, hey, I'm here to collect for Rav Papa. They'll say, well, you're not the owner, let him come and bring us to court. And so he wanted to transfer ownership. So he did. He transferred it to Rav Shmuel bar Acha. How did he do it? How did he transfer this money? Because the money isn't here. He can't just hand him the money. It's in this faraway place. So you know what he did? He transferred it agav the threshold of his house. He said, listen, I'm transferring you the doorstep of my house. You own my doorstep. that's a piece of land. And then agav, you also get the coins. And that it worked. He went there and he was able to get the money. And when he returned, when Rav Shmuel returned, Rav Papa was so happy to see him because he was successful and got his money back that he went out all the way to Tavach to greet him. What we see here is that, yes, you can acquire money agav, land, and so that therefore money is included in the category of nechasim she'en lahem acharayut. Im nechasim she'yesh lahem acharayut, you can acquire also coins. Agav, land, that's part of nechasim. Shetara ikre nichse damar bar Yitzchak shene shetarot hen v'amar zechu besadeh zeh lifloni v'chitvu lo et ashtar chozer bashtar eno chozer basadeh. A deed itself, a document, a legal document, is also called nechasim. And we prove that from the following. It's actually not from this statement, but from the next one that we're about to read. But we have to build up to it. So Rabbah Bar Yitzchak says there are two types of deeds that can acquire land or be a proof to that you acquired land. The first one is, let's say I tell you, I want you two people, I tell two people, I want you to acquire this land on behalf of someone else. I really want to give this land to my friend Mr. Friedman. He's not here. And so I tell you two witnesses, go and acquire the land on his behalf, which you can do. So you go and you lock the gate or something on his behalf, and I also add and write a shtar that proves that we did this and the land belongs to him. So then, if I do that and I change my mind, chozer bashtar ve'no chozer basadeh, I can change my mind regarding writing the contract, but I cannot change my mind regarding the land. Once you too go and do an acquisition on the land is already sent. That's it. All right, you press send, it's gone. You can't get it back because you already made an act of acquisition. But since you didn't write the deed yet, I can stop you from writing the deed. Why would I want to stop you from writing the deed? It could be because I don't want there to be a deed. I did want to give him a gift, but I don't. Once there's a deed that publicizes that I gave away or I sold land, and then people will say, "Oh, look, he sold land. I guess he's in trouble financially, and they won't want to do business with me." So in that case, I can do that. And now, that's the first type. Second type of deed is if I tell two witnesses, go and acquire this land on behalf of Mr. Friedman on condition that you write a deed for him. And in that case, even if the witnesses went and they locked the gate and they did an act of acquisition, but they didn't write the deed yet, I can change my mind and say, you know what? I changed my mind. I don't want to give him this property. Why? Because it was on condition. So since the deed was not written yet, and so since the condition was not yet fulfilled, therefore the act of acquisition is not final, and I can change my mind. Here the proof is going to be from the next statement of Rav Chia bar Avin, who told Rav Huna, actually, there are three types of documents that can be written up for acquisition of a property. The first two that we already mentioned. The third one is if, let's say I'm selling land, and I want to be prepared. So I go ask a scribe to write up a document of sale, even though I didn't actually sell the land yet. I'm just carrying it around and holding it, and I'm going to wait until I get my money. And once I get my money, then I will give the deed over to the buyer. As we learned in a Mishnah, a scribe is permitted to write a deed of sale on behalf of a seller, even though the buyer isn't there. That's okay, and he'll hold on to it, and eventually he will give it to him. And here's the chidush. Even if I don't give the deed over physically to the buyer, once the buyer acquires the land, in other words, once the buyer gives me money or however he's going to acquire it, let's say by money, once he gives me money, then the land goes to him and the deed it transfers agav the land. So even if the deed I forgot it at home in my in my desk, and I didn't bring it to the closing. That's okay. It doesn't matter because once you do the sale, finalize the sale. So this is called a kinyan agav, and that's another type of deed that fits in with this category. It's a kind of deed that depends on the sale. V'zohi sheshaninu nechasim she'en lahem achariyut neknin im nechasim sheyesh ham achariyut bekesef b'shtar u'behazaka. And this is an example of what we learned in the Mishnah Kiddushin of property that cannot be used as a guarantee, meaning a movable item, which is acquired together with land that can be used as a guarantee, as long as the land transfers with money, with a deed, or with chazakah. So in this case, if you used money or chazakah, the deed, which is at home in my desk, gets transferred. What we see from here is that we're including deed within the category of nechasim, she'en lahem achrayut. So that means a deed is called nechasim. Okay, it's a long proof for a simple point, but it does prove the point. Behema ikre nichse ditnan, hamakdish nechasav hayta bahen behema re'uya legabe mizbeach zecharim olot unkebot yimacheru lesorche zibche shelamim. We're going to prove that animals are also included within the category of nechasim, as it says in the Mishnah in Masechet Shekalim. Someone consecrates nechasav, all of his property. And among the things that he owns are animals that are fit to be sacrificed. In general, when you consecrate something, we assume that the consecration is for bedek havayit, because you're consecrating all kinds of things. Maybe you're consecrating books and tables and whatever. And so most things, the Bet HaMikdash is not using them as a sacrifice. It's just going to take the value of them, and you can either redeem it, or they'll sell it, or if they want to use it, they can use it. But it's not consecrated as a sanctified animal for the Mizbeach. However, if I sanctify an animal that has no blemish, that can be used as a sacrifice, then we have to assume that it's actually being consecrated with that higher level of not just Kiddushat Damim, not just the holiness of its monetary value, but Kiddushat Haguf. It itself is consecrated as a sacrifice. And therefore, if I say, I'm consecrating all of my property, and I have some animals that can be used on the Mizbeach, so then it depends. If it's a male animal, then it should be sold to someone who has to bring an olah, and then that very animal will be brought as an olah. Olah can only be a male. If it's a nikeva, a female animal, then it cannot be used as an olah, but it can be used as a shilamim, and so therefore it will be sold for the purpose of shilamim. If someone needs to bring a shilamim, so then they can buy it, and so the animal itself will be used. What do we prove from here? That when I say makdish nechasav, all my nechasim are donated, so that includes animals. The same thing regarding birds, those also called nechasim. Because if I say I'm consecrating all of my property, and among it was things that can be offered on the altar itself, like wine, oil, and birds, then the birds, in fact, get sacrificed. So you see that birds, we are included in the category of nechasim. Tefillin ikre nechse ditnan, makdish nechasav ma'alin lo tefillin. Tefillin also are included in nechasim, and you might think that they're just holy objects, and maybe they're not considered, like owned, like property. But no, that's not true, because if I say all my property is donated, is consecrated, then the tefillin are also consecrated. But of course, the person needs his tefillin, is going to have to wear it tomorrow morning, and therefore we assess the value of the tefillin, and he will have to pay and redeem them, and that way keeps the tefillin, and the kedusha goes to the money, and the money goes to the Bet HaMikdash. Ibaya lehu sefer Torah mai kevan de la mizdaban asud lezaboneh lav nichsehu or dilma kevan de mizdaban lilmod Torah v'lisa isha nichsehu teko. A question was asked in the Bet Midrash. What about a sefer Torah? If I say I'm donating I'm consecrating all of my property. Does that include a Sefer Torah also? You might say no, because a Sefer Torah, you're not allowed to sell a Sefer Torah. You can't even sell an old Sefer Torah to buy a new Sefer Torah. It's the highest level of holiness, and so since it can't be sold, therefore, it's not called property. Part of, what does it mean property? Property means something I own. What does it mean to own something? It means that I have a right to sell it. So since a Sefer Torah, although I have usage of it, it's in my domain, I control it, but you can't say it's property if I don't have a right to sell it. And therefore, maybe a Sefer Torah is not called property. It's so holy, it's its own special thing. Or, on the other hand, there are cases where you're allowed to sell a Sefer Torah. You're allowed to sell a Sefer Torah in order to enable someone to study Torah. They don't have enough money to be able to sustain themselves. We need to support Torah learning. You can sell a Sefer Torah for that. Or a person is getting married and he cannot afford the wedding. So you can sell a Sefer Torah to pay for someone, to help someone to get married. And therefore, since you can sell a Sefer Torah in certain circumstances, so therefore it is called property. Teko, we leave that last question standing. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.